All right, welcome back, everyone. We're in what, week 3? Our assignment was to read the book of Exodus with one question in mind, which is,
what does it tell us about the character of God?
what does it tell us about the character of God? So, just a quick summary. So, as we ended Genesis, of course, we have Joseph leading the people and all of that story. Now the people are in Egypt. They're multiplying. The Egyptians are starting to get very concerned.
Right.
That they are going to outnumber them and take over them. The slavery of Israel. We have the introduction of Moses comes in. The story of the Exodus covers the Red Sea, the 10 plagues. A fantastic story, the 10 plagues. We have the people being led out into the desert, God looking after them, the complaining of the food, the manna, the lessons of the Sabbath, a lot of rules, a lot of regulations, a lot of
10 Commandments.
The commandments are coming in. We have the setting up and the rules of the tabernacle, the priesthood, and then ultimately finishing with God, his very presence filling the tabernacle. And that is a very quick synopsis of a great amount of information. So what do we get from this story? What are we learning about the character of God? Let's talk about the plagues for a minute. 10 plagues God brings on the Egyptians. What's the backstory there?
Well, that Moses, when the people of Israel were enslaved and Moses was born, all of the babies were supposed to be killed. His mother put him in a basket. He is found. He is raised in Pharaoh's home. When he is 40, he kills an Egyptian who is being mean to a slave. He runs away. Then, when he is 80 years old, the Lord tells him, go back and set my people free from slavery.
Interesting, this whole thing with Moses. So, if you don't know the story well, so Moses, of course, is born of the Israelites.
Yes.
There has been a death decree by the emperor or Pharaoh, whoever it was, that all of the boys were to be murdered.
That's right,
So
because the number of Israelites was just growing incredibly.
Moses' mother, of course, tries to find a way around. She keeps him as long as she can. Ultimately, they put him in the basket. He floats down the Nile. The Pharaoh's one of his daughters finds him, and then so Moses is raised in the royal palace.
It's funny. He is supposed to be killed, and instead he gets this wonderful education.
Yes, so he's educated as at this civilization is probably the high watermark of all civilizations at the time. The best colleges, probably trained to be a very powerful military commander. Interesting how God has a long-term vision.
Right.
God knows he's going to use Moses to lead his people out of bondage from the Egyptians. And so the interesting thing, so when Moses finds out that he is what his lineage is. I don't know if he always knew. We know that God worked it out so that his own mother kind of raised him as a maid, unbeknownst to the Egyptians. And you can imagine that she had told him the stories, and he knew exactly where he was. So there comes a point when he becomes a man that he witnesses something.
Right. So a slave is being mistreated.
One of his own people.
That's right. And he goes and defends, kills.
He takes matters into his own hands.
Right. He defends perhaps a little more vigorously than he ought to.
So he sees one of his countrymen being beaten by a taskmaster. He takes it upon himself, and he murders this guy, and he tries to cover up the murder by burying him in the sand.
Didn't work out.
A couple days go by. There's a dispute, an argument between two of his countrymen, and he tries to intervene and tells them, why are you fighting amongst yourself? We're all brothers here.
Are you going to kill one of us too?
Right.
Like you did the other day?
Right. So Moses finds out, and he's terrified, like someone saw. If this is being talked about by everyone, it's only a matter of time before my life is worthless.
Right.
So he escapes and leaves this life of privilege and goes out and hooks up with a family somewhere and spends the next 40 years working as a shepherd.
Right. Gets married.
A very different lifestyle.
It's interesting to me that the woman he marries, her father is a priest.
Her father's a priest.
Right. So he goes back.
So I guess the question is, trying to stay on topic here, so when Moses found out that I don't know, we don't know all the details, but we can assume that Moses found out that maybe he was going to be used as an instrument of God to free Israel. And so, was he partnering with God? Did he seek God's partnership and guidance when he killed the Egyptian?
No.
Is that how God intended to use Moses?
One would believe no, that there would have been a better path.
Moses thinking, I'm in the prime of my life, I've just finished war college, I have all of the strength and vigor of life, now is the time for me to do a great work for God. Wouldn't that be how most of us would think we'd see things?
Well, we certainly see ourselves in a different position than the Lord does.
So the interesting thing, as you just said, is so Moses is driven out 40 years, now he's an old man, he's in his 80s.
Right.
And not the firebrand that he was when he was in his 40s. Been chasing the sheep around, a completely different life.
Right.
Now God can use him.
Burning bush.
That's when God comes to him.
That's right.
And Moses is not all that jazzed about taking on this new role.
Exceedingly reluctant.
He says, talks about how he's not a great speaker and he's making all these excuses. I think the interesting thing is that now Moses, when Moses thinks that he's at his weakest and his lowest point, when he's the most useless in his life, God doesn't see it that way.
Right.
God sees.
Well, it was like he had these 40 years to become who he thought he should be, and then it's the 40 years to become who the Lord wanted him to be before the Lord could use him. It's kind of like this reverse pinnacle, what we see as important versus what maybe the Lord sees as important.
So oftentimes we think that maybe God gives us an idea for a ministry or something that we should do. We've had this discussion experience before that, okay, I would relate it to our first property, that we really felt both of us impressed that God wanted us to get out of the city and to get out of the country. We didn't really know why. That veil is starting to be lifted now, and I'm starting to see a little bit more why. But I can speak for myself. I kind of took the attitude, well, thank you for the idea. I'll take it from here. And I did not partner with God, and I did not wait on God, but went out and did it myself. I went out and metaphorically speaking, took matters into my own hands.
It didn't work out so well.
It didn't work out so well.
Right.
So Moses is now, when he's at his oldest and most frail, now God can use him.
That's right.
Because we shouldn't rely upon our own understanding and our own wisdom, but by following the dictates of God. So Moses goes in and marches in very reluctantly with his brother or his nephew.
His brother.
His brother. Mm-hmm. Marches in right up to it must have taken some courage. Up the stairs to the Pharaoh and says, I want you to release these slaves, these Israelites you've had for 400 years?
Right. And presumably this is the Pharaoh he knows and has grown up with and had a long-term relationship with, and he ran, he fled. And so what an awkward meeting.
Tradition has it, I don't know that I have a scripture for this, but many people believe that the very man that was sitting in the seat of Pharaoh may have been Moses' half-brother that he grew up with, maybe even trained to fight with and went to school with and grew up in the very same household. So quite an interesting meeting. The Bible doesn't speak a lot about this, but you can kind of surmise. So 10 plagues. We have first the blood, the frogs, we have the lice, the flies, the disease, the hail, the locust, and ultimately ending with the death of the firstborn. So how many chances did God give these Egyptians? In the dark.
Yeah.
How many chances did God give these Egyptians to do the right thing?
Many.
So why, I guess the question that comes to mind is why did the Egyptians get 10 chances, but Sodom and Gomorrah, they didn't get 10 chances?
We don't know that. We just know what's written, but a lot of things happened that were not written. Perhaps they would have had 100 chances. Perhaps we hear about 10 plagues, but I'd have to go back and reread, but could there possibly have been more? Could they have had more chances? I think actually, if I recall, with one of the plagues, it said that it did not come upon the Egyptians who believed. It's right in the middle, and I don't remember which one it was, but they were, those who believed in the Lord were not plagued even though they were Egyptians. And this is before...
That's absolutely right, because
Yeah.
we talk about the mixed multitude that went out when they left Egypt and crossed the Red Sea. Those were Egyptians that responded to the power of God,
Right.
that saw what was going on. Do you think that when after they had went through these 9 terrible plagues, and the Egyptians had witnessed that the Hebrews had not been affected by them, and when they saw them painting the blood on the doorpost, do you think that maybe 1 or 2 of them did the same thing?
Yeah.
Were they saved because they were good and they hadn't persecuted the Hebrews?
No, I mean, we don't know that any of those Hebrews were good. We just know that they put blood on the doorpost.
Right, which represents Christ. And we're coming back we're coming back just like we talked about last week with the ark. The folks that got on the ark weren't necessarily the best folks that were left on the planet, but they were the ones that simply got on the ark. They trusted God and got on the ark, and it was through the ark that they were saved.
Well, I mean, I think in Exodus it really discusses how stiff-necked, hard-headed, reluctant, complaining, whiny people these Hebrews were. Oh, you took me out of slavery, put me back. It was so much better. Oh,
we don't want this. We don't want this worthless stuff. This is the manna.
When you read through this, you can understand that it was a hardship, but you also think, buck up.
So the 10 plagues, the blood and the frogs. We'll talk about that. So is there significance there? Does that tell us anything about the character of God? Why the blood? Was that symbolic of something? What's he trying to tell the Egyptians by turning the water to blood?
Well, I mean, you can think of the blood of the Lord. The blood is also the last plague has to do with blood. There's...
How about all of the death of the Hebrew children that they had cast into the Nile, to the crocodiles?
Yeah.
When they turned the blood, when God turned the blood, the river Nile to blood, it was a form of justice. It was pointing to them as a very stark reminder of what they had been doing.
That they killed all the firstborn, or all the boys.
What they used to do, I mean, the decree that was given by Pharaoh was, as soon as these male children are born, I want you to bash their heads against the birthing stool or against the wall, and what they would do is they would throw them in the Nile and they would be devoured by the crocodiles. And so this is symbolic of that. As far as the frogs and the lice and the flies, these were common idols,
right,
that the Egyptians worshipped.
I like you, frog, when I worship you, but please don't come in such great number.
The Egyptians believed. I mean, it was the ancient way of thinking that because that the Hebrews were in slavery to them. That what would that say to them? That it would say that their gods were more powerful than the Hebrews' gods.
Right.
Right. Because they had overcome them.
That's how we look at things. We look at things from a worldly perspective. And
right.
So here in the world, that would make sense.
So God is trying to turn these views, these heathen views of worshiping these stupid idols, to the frogs. So can you imagine, as we were talking earlier, is that you are sweeping up and piling up these enormous stinking piles of rotting frogs, and then you're supposed to go on your Sabbath service and kneel down and worship them. It starts to point out how ludicrous that is.
Yeah.
And the same thing with the flies and the lice and all of those. The Red Sea. So fast forward here. So we come to finally Pharaoh lets them go. They come to the Red Sea, and they are delivered from the Egyptian army, and now they're out in the desert. And God, we have the story of the Mount Sinai with the thunder and the great smoke and the lightning and all of that. And I think this is where people start to think, well, there's a very big difference between God the Father, who is thunders on Sinai, and gentle Jesus, meek and mild, who comes and washes the feet of his apostles. But the most interesting thing is that Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians, if you go and read it, and tells us that pillar of smoke, that leading evidence, or that manifestation of God, was Christ himself. So it is Christ who thundered and smoked and had the fire and put the fear and the terror into the children of Israel.
Well, and sometimes don't we need different things to get our attention.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes someone can say something to me and I get it. And sometimes I have to make the same mistake 1,000 times before I get it. And here, the Lord, I mean, clearly He is showing them He's holy. He's showing them He's strong. He's showing them He can do whatever He wants, both to the Egyptians and for them. I mean, manna from the sky, birds coming down, plagues. He is powerful. And yet, they don't seem to listen. They are not getting the loud voices or the small voices. They need thunder.
That's the only thing they would react to.
Yeah.
And it's easy. We can't be too hard on them because now, where did they come out of? They were 400 years in bondage and as slaves, being treated terribly by the Egyptians.
Right.
When they're coming out of there, they're not an educated people that understand reason and that God can speak to and sit them down. Now, children, I want you to sit down and listen, and I'm going to teach you the way. They came out of a violent environment.
Right, and hardworking,
most likely
all the time.
Uneducated. No doubt. I mean, we have generations now that are born into slavery. They most likely didn't have the ability to lead, to read. They knew nothing about God other than what had been passed down. And after 400 years, I can imagine that the children didn't really want to hear about it anymore from their parents.
Right. Well, especially like, who is this God who's keeping us in slavery?
If He's so powerful, then what is this?
Yeah.
Why doesn't He deliver us from this? And so the analogy that's so appropriate for this is when you wonder, why the smoke and why the lightning and this great show of power that frightened them. It was like an unruly group of kids in a classroom. A teacher, if the kids are not behaving and they're running around and they're throwing things and they won't listen, does the teacher have to take drastic measures to get their attention?
Well, it's kind of like if the building was on fire, she could go, "Children, if there's a fire," she'd have to stand on the desk and clap her hands and
maybe
fire!
throw a few erasers
lights on and off, let's go.
Right.
You need a little oomph.
At the fear of making the students afraid of her.
Right.
She's willing to rant and to scream and to yell and to get up and maybe throw some things around the classroom because what? Because something, if she doesn't get control of the class, she can't get their attention, what will happen to them?
They'll just continue.
They will continue. They'll stay in the classroom and the fire will consume and everyone will die. So
it's like if you're a parent and you've had a child throw a temper tantrum and you're at the store and they want a candy bar and you don't want to give them a candy bar and they throw themselves on the ground, and every parent is watching and you might be embarrassed for a second, but you know that everyone knows exactly what you're going through. That you can look at them and say, all right, it's time to go. Or you can just be like, okay, well, I'm going to continue shopping. And the child is so, oh, you're not paying attention to me. And their tantrum is over and they follow you because they don't want to be left alone. So a drastic measure, you're never really going to leave your child. But if they see you walking away, they think that's drastic. So
they think,
you need to get some attention here.
You need to do, and God is willing to do whatever He needs to do to get people's attention because the consequences are so dire.
Right.
Even at the fear of making people afraid of Him. Interesting contrast that. There was another man there. Was Moses afraid of God like the people were?
He was their friend. I mean, he would say no, he was not afraid. But he was certainly in awe. But he asked, can I see you?
So as he's walking up and the smoke and the fire and the rending of the rocks, he's not afraid.
Right.
He goes up there and he even says, there is no need to be afraid. Is that the relationship that God and Moses had? Is that ultimately what He wanted? Rather than terrifying them and thundering on Sinai.
Oh, absolutely.
But they wouldn't hear a small voice.
That's right.
Sometimes the only thing that we'll hear, the only thing that will get our attention is God has to speak and act that way.
It's interesting because Moses, we see throughout his life that he can make some very rash decisions that the Lord does not agree with. He, kills the Egyptian, so he has to go off. The Lord has to wait for him to come around and learn his lesson before he does what he wants to do. He comes up there and he's being told, you're on holy ground. He ruins the first 10 commandments on stone. He's hits the rock with his temper comes out that he's not as good about listening as he should be.
That's an interesting point. A lot of people, and I remember the first time I read it, I thought it was very severe that we know the story. So the people were grumbling, and they said, "Why have you brought this to this worthless place? And we have any water?" Moses goes to God, and God tells him, "Speak to the rock, Moses."
Mm-hmm.
Moses comes back, and he doesn't speak to the rock, but he starts whacking it with his stick, and it's like, "Should we bring you worthless rebels? Shall we bring forth water from this rock?" Portraying God as being angry at them when he was not.
Right.
And so it was Moses was such a loyal friend and put up with so much from those people. Does it not seem unfair that the poor old man, after everything that he'd been through, and for one lapse of patience, losing his temper one time, was forbidden from entering into the promised land?
Well, one time. No. More than one time. I mean, in Exodus, we read about various occasions where he has lost his temper, where he has done things that are wrong. And I'm going to guess there were more. And so we don't know everything that led, how many times he misrepresented the Lord. How many times, not only were was Israel hard-necked, stiff-necked people, but that he perhaps was as well. I mean, he will use whatever, the Lord will use who he will. And he used Moses here. But that does not mean that Moses was easy. We see he's reluctant, he has a temper, he's doing all these things that the Lord would prefer him not to do.
Moses said about himself that I am the meekest of all men. Was he boasting?
Well, at the time, meek would not have been considered a high character trait.
Would that being meek, would that be a characteristic that would bring you to ultimate to be a man of power, a leader, or even a pharaoh?
No.
No. Meekness was despised in those days. What was respected was power, a
Right.
strong man, authority.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting that this judgment leveled upon Moses was so harsh. Moses even continued to beg God, "Please let me go into this good land that you've promised us." And God said, ultimately, "Speak to me no more of this." We look at that like, well, all the things that God did, or Moses did for God, and this one thing that he did wrong, and he's being punished so severely. But what I've come to understand is that when we are representing God, even those of us who are Christians, or claiming publicly professing to be Christians, when we do something that portrays God in a poor light, or reflects poorly on his character, or we do something that would bring reproach or hypocrisy on Christianity, do we not do much more damage than a person that does not profess to be a Christian?
Yeah.
So when God gives us the honor of being a Christian, a member of his family, is there more expected from us?
I think so.
Is what we do and what we say much, if we go contrary to the teaching of God, is it much more damaging than someone who'd never believed?
Yeah. But it's so interesting to me because oftentimes you hear God can take care of his own reputation. And yet at the same time, even though we know God can, and God can do whatever he wants, and the things he does and requires of us are for us to learn, he still would like for us to respect his reputation and not misrepresent him, even though he can take care of it just fine. One thing I find very interesting is that in Genesis, the Lord doesn't talk about holy very much. But in Exodus, it's holy. This is holy ground. This is holy. There seems to be much more reference to holy. And, the tabernacle, things are holy.
A lot of rules. A lot of rules,
and also a lot of skills. I think in here we see that people get skills in order to get the tabernacle built, but there's holy spots and there's certain rules what you need to do and how to be reverent.
I think it's a really good point. What we're talking about the Ten Commandments. We see God has given the Ten Commandments, or the law of God, in here, and I think many Christians and non-Christians believe that when they look at the Ten Commandments, they think, look at this. Look at this burden, this heavy burden that God has put upon people, telling them it's taking away their freedoms to do what they want, taking away their ability to have free will and to free choice, and making them labor under these these difficult set of rules that most people can't live up to. But when you start looking at the bigger picture, it's really sad that God has had to give us those rules at all. Isn't it sad that God had to write down at that time, and still does today, that you shouldn't murder your mother-in-law? So going back to the mother-in-law, it's a sad state of affairs. It was a sad state at the time that these people, it had to be written down, again, that we shouldn't murder our neighbor or brother-in-law, that we shouldn't lie to each other, that we shouldn't steal each other's wives, that we shouldn't covet and try to get revenge on people. It's how free would we be in a society where everyone followed the Ten Commandments?
That would be great.
We could
Trust each other?
we wouldn't have a police department, wouldn't have an IRS, wouldn't have local law enforcement, there wouldn't be any locks on doors, there wouldn't be any jails, there wouldn't be any wars, there wouldn't be all of the human suffering. Would it be a very free society?
Very.
That you could go and go to and fro, that your young daughters could walk in any city and never be, no fear of them being attacked or hurt or harmed, no fear of your son being shipped off to a foreign war somewhere. What God is proposing, and if we would finally get to the point where we would, as what he would like us to do, is to be in agreement with these things are universal. These things are where freedom comes from. We grow up, we start to see that it's not a heavy, burdensome set of rules that have been placed upon us, but we are so rebellious and we are so evil and so wicked that God has to go so far as to write these things down to remind us that we shouldn't do them. Mm-hmm. And so where freedom would come from, and what God is ultimately trying to get us to, where we don't have to look at the law and the commandments and say, oh, the burdensome rules that we have to toil under, but we can grow up and say, I agree with you, God. We don't need these written anymore. And when we're in the kingdom, it would be nice that maybe that he'll preserve all these things, and there'll be a museum up there, and nobody will need to go every day and go through the rules. Okay, I have to remember not to kill any of the angels today, and I have to make sure that I don't steal anything out of God's sanctuary, and this reminder, it won't be there.
Yeah.
It won't be necessary, and God has told us that he wants these written on our heart. All right, I think my camera clicks off at 30 minutes there. We'll let you guys go. So you know your assignment. Read through the book of Leviticus and remember, what do these stories tell us about the character of God? And Lord willing, we'll be covering this next week. So let's close in prayer. So please join us and bow your heads. And we thank you, Lord, for this opportunity to come before your people. Help us to read these stories, and especially the difficult ones, and to understand what you're trying to do. Help us to remember that you're willing to do whatever it takes to bring your people to a better knowledge of you. We thank you for this opportunity to be in teaching and being in this country where we can do so freely. I give these thanks and blessings in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. That's it.
Thanks for all your editing, love.